Aqui, na Klabin, a gente dá muito valor à embalagem. Mas, quando falamos de pessoas, o que vem de dentro é muito mais importante do que o que se vê por fora. Há alguns anos, a Klabin passou a dar mais foco e atuar com mais intensidade nos temas relacionados à diversidade. As ações, antes pontuais, tomaram forma, ganharam tamanho e geraram resultados. Hoje, a Klabin conta com um modelo de atuação que direciona as ações voltadas para a diversidade na empresa. Definimos onde queremos chegar e, agora, trabalhamos ações que nos levam para mais perto desse objetivo de sermos uma empresa cada dia mais diversa e inclusiva. Para chegar lá, trabalhamos em 4 frentes. Área corporativa, que faz a gestão do tema, desenvolvendo ações e programas alinhados à estratégia da companhia. Comissão de gente, que discute e recomenda ações para aprovação em diretoria. Comitê de Diversidade, que constrói e apoia ações locais com representantes das unidades. E os grupos de afinidade, formados por colaboradores voluntários que se dedicam aos temas de diversidade como raça e etnia, gênero, diversidade geracional e LGBTI+. Cada grupo é responsável por discutir, construir e apoiar ações que fortaleçam seu tema e propósito específico. E é sobre eles que você vai conhecer um pouco mais agora.
Hello, I'm Nina from Klabin's Corporate Diversity Department, and I'm here to chat with members of our affinity groups about the importance of discussing intersectionality as part of diversity. We have Maria Luisa from Caio, Miguel from Grupo Black, Aline from Colors, Caio from Bemo, and Ivone from Multi Klabin. Before we begin, I'd like to put things into context. What is intersectionality and why are we talking about it? Intersectionality is a concept that explains the dynamic relationship between the different social problems that can lead to inequality. For example, we know there are inequalities in the relationship between men and women, white and black people, and so on. Intersectionality proposes that we should not exclude or rank these characteristics, or markers of identities, as we call them, but rather try to understand the relationship between all of these markers and the superimposition of discriminations that stem from them. So it's an analytic tool, which is important for us to think about social relationships involving race, sex, age, and social class, and the challenges involved in the creation of effective projects, including all of these characteristics. Going back to the previous example, just as we need to develop affirmative actions aimed at reducing inequalities between men and women, we also need to bear in mind that these actions, which are constructed thinking about women or women in general, will not be effective if we think about the relationship between white and black women, or black women, heterosexual, or LGBT. So I invite you to think about this pool of characteristics, so to speak. To illustrate this point, we can begin by discussing gender, a topic discussed in 3 of our groups in Klabin. From different perspectives. Malu, would you like to be first?
Yes, Nina, thank you. Hi, everyone.
And the answer is yes. I believe I speak on behalf of all representatives of our affinity groups when I say that the issue of gender really encompasses intersectionality. In the case of women-related topics, which are the major focus of Caio, the response is more direct. Gender impacts our work relations as women on a daily basis, whether we are aware of it or not. These days, and it's common sense, there are many opportunities to increase the number of women in corporate sectors and leadership positions, and we also know this scenario is rooted in our culture and the way we view the role of women in society. The bright side is that more and more we see men and women becoming aware and acting in order to understand the problem and to play a part in changing this scenario. We also know it's not simple or easy because the stigma has been around for a long time, for centuries. But even so, actions such as the ones promoted by the Affinity Group show that progress is possible.
Hello everyone, how are you doing? Well, in our department, in our organization memo, we have discussions of masculinity, and we discuss, about people who identify as males in terms of society. Men are usually stuck in what we call the man box, in a pattern. Any behavior outside of this box, which is considered girl stuff or gay stuff, it makes you believe that anything outside of this pattern would make you less of a man. But we know that the discussion about gender is also the role of men, and we have to take on our responsibility in this debate. So we reflect about gender, and we promote rounds of discussion in the company, and we share stories and experiences between our members.
Caio, it's interesting when you talk about being less male, because from the LGBTI plus perspective, the concept of intersectionality is strongly supported when we discuss gender, because we already talk about several minority groups which are underrepresented, groups such as lesbian women, gay men, bisexual people, regarding sexual orientation, sexuality, and trans women and men with respect to gender. Both of these groups are often the target of aggressive and microaggressive behaviors, given their sexual or gender orientation deviates, so to speak, from their biological sex. And it's always important to mention that talking about gender, the situation of trans people should be borne in mind. So, trans people are those who feel their gender identity does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. And oftentimes, trans women, females, trans men are judged, disrespected, hurt, or even murdered just because they are transsexual. And I wouldn't have brought it up here if it wasn't for the sad reality that for the 12th year in a row, Brazil has been the leader in transsexual murder globally. So I feel it's important to mention it here. It's not a matter of choice. It may sound silly, but it's too important to say these things. And this discussion is also important because for the most part, trans people are excluded from the formal labor market and end up in underpaid jobs or as sex workers, and in this manner they form yet another minority group which is underrepresented in society. I believe Miguel has a lot to add about it.
That's right, Aline. Speaking of representation, when it comes to the cross-sectionality work that we are talking about here, this becomes very relevant when we approach this topic from an ethical and racial perspective. For black women, there is a very prejudiced stigma that is very strong. Considering our current socio-economic context, you see black women as being really disadvantaged in terms of opportunities, and the research doesn't lie. Black women are the ones that are paid less when compared to black men, and black men, in comparison, are paid less than white women, and all of those are paid less than white men. Black women make up a huge portion of our social pyramid. If you have questions about that, all you have to do is ask, how many black executives do you know? Black women executives. According to the last polls, we see that the Brazilian society is comprised in its majority by blacks. 56% of Brazilian people identify themselves as black. And it's also comprised by women. 58% of Brazilian people are women. So we have to conclude that a very significant portion of our population is comprised by black women, and the absence of their representation in the corporate, private environment as well as the public environment is really astounding.
And if we broaden the scope and move from the pillar of gender to daily living scenarios, another scenario we often discuss and that we know affects more than one minority underrepresented group is an excessive concern about self-image, clothes, for example. I believe we have a lot to say about it. Can you start, Malu?
Yes, Nina, thank you.
Unfortunately, we as women still have to think very carefully about the way we dress for all sorts of occasions. We all know that women choose their clothes carefully because we must be aware of several possibilities, from judgment of character based on what we wear to more serious issues such as sexual harassment and crime. Unfortunately, there's still a stereotype related to the way we dress, so it's not uncommon to see the way a woman dresses in a corporate environment as inappropriate and demand much more effort, so to speak, with regard to appearance, clothes, manicure, makeup, hairstyle, relative to what we see in men. And just as Miguel has said when we discussed intersectionality, we can see the same problem of image and clothing is magnified when we talk about black women, for example, because then you add the fact of being black to the fact of being a woman. And this is a very sad and concerning reality, and that's why we combine our efforts to break this paradigm.
That's indeed. When you talk about black women, that goes beyond what they dress. We are talking about the appearance as well. Think about how many black women have had and still have to accept their hair, for example. A lot of them went through a transition in this aspect, and they cater to a cultural pattern that is imposed by them. They are starting to accept themselves how they are. So it's not about the way that black people dress, but it's a stigma that they have because of structural racism. There is a historical social construct in our society, which is the main factor that contributes to this form of racism, and oftentimes that results into very embarrassing situations. I'll explain. We have heard stories of black women that arrive sometimes at a apartment building to visit their friends or even to get into a venue where they are going to speak. They have a talk to deliver and they are referred to the service area, irrespective of what clothes they are wearing. Another example is black men that are walking on a shopping mall, on a high-end shopping mall with wearing suits and ties, and they are confused as security guards. Or in the supermarkets, they are followed. The use of a mask, it's an alert when you walk into a grocery store. There are reports of people that avoided using dark masks early into the pandemic because of that situation. As we can see, the problem is not really about the appearance, which oftentimes is overlooked, whether it's the clothes or the hairstyle, but it's really a stigma that is imposed on black people through the years. That's the effect of structural racism, and absolutely Aline can go into a little more detail, right, Aline?
Really, Miguel, what you said is very serious. It's so serious that I believe it's worth mentioning the typical bad jokes we witness at work, such as, oh, you're wearing a pink shirt. But it's so serious that I think we've moved beyond this sort of comment. Talking specifically about self-image, there is an aspect, in particular for lesbian women and gay men and bisexual people. Among them, we see an excessive concern not to having an excessively gay look, and this applies to gay men with regard to femininity and lesbian women with regard to masculinity, for example, for fear of aggression and violence in the streets, at the office, anywhere. Of course, this does not apply to all LGBTI plus people, but it's a cause of suffering in daily living situations, in the work environment, and this has impacts. The sensation of being constantly watchful, the anxiety, the sensation of not belonging to that environment, to act defensively, to try to change your behavior to be more accepted, among other impacts. And that is why we need more and more actions to prevent these aggressions, microaggressions as we name them. One example I could give you of a current corporate program which involves intersectionality is Integra Clubbing. an internship program for low-income students launched in 2020 and is now starting its second cycle. This program includes intersectionality because it's not only aimed at low-income students, but we also wanted in our selective process to include people from other minorities. And at the end of the process, we had 60% of our candidates were women, 25% black, and 25% LGBT, on top of being a low-income student. And how about you in other groups? What's your experience with intersectionality? What challenges, impacts, and actions could you share? Nina, what a great example, because it truly shows how intersectionality can be viewed and resolved. To begin my participation in this conversation, I'd like to emphasize that this treatment of the issue of diversity via these affinity groups in Klabin is a very important strategy, because to talk about diversity is still essential. We must still talk about diversity. In multi-clubbing, we seek synergism between different relationships, and we try to improve and innovate processes through the interaction between these different groups. Intersectionality is an important process to prevent different groups in clubbing, which have been named already, from being isolated in their little boxes, each one of them in its box, discussing their own problem of inequality. We must think about how intersectionality can help us approach these topics and about how important the topic is to us at work as a whole and in other aspects of our lives at home, in our relationships, and so on. I'd also like to remind you about the importance of a transformation ideal. The foundation of these actions with regard to diversity has a lot to do with transformation. We want to transform our society. We want to change the culture. And a changing culture is not the result of a single action, but rather of the interrelation, the connection that exists between the different actions and the transparency in the execution of these actions. One example that shows how it can be discussed is to start by addressing traumas. We see that in each of these affinity groups, which discuss the issue of diversity, several traumas are addressed. Caio, Aline, Miguel, Malu, each one of you has brought different potential causes of trauma up in this discussion, and we must start to talk openly about this, not only in different groups, but in a way that allows the interconnection between these groups. We also must discuss a matter that goes beyond diversity. The diversity debate and in the culture in which we live creates a power relationship that must be broken. Otherwise, we will keep on discussing and we won't achieve the results that we want, which is the change of this culture. I believe we must, and it's a major challenge to deconstruct this scenario. Oh, there comes Ivone talking about deconstruction, messing around, but it's not about messing around. It's about deconstructing this mindset, the way we have been taught to think about this manner, in this manner. I believe that more and more in different groups must increasingly promote interaction and try to find this point in common. Miguel, don't you think we will get there if we follow this path?
That's right, Ivone. No question about it. The more interaction we have between all groups, the more rapidly this concept is going to disseminate, and the better we will transition between those diversities, and it's going to be a seamless process. All we have to do is undertake the journey. Reflection is a part of this construction process. One has to create and strengthen values that are about respect and diversity, and there is also a need to deconstruct myths and biased thinking that really affect inclusion. As we talk to the public, we realize that the perception of this necessity of the whole is still unknown. The challenge is major, but it is possible. We believe that the best way to treat with diversity and disseminating knowledge is to go in depth in the empathy as well. We can only talk about the difficulty of the whole when we understand the peculiarities and the specificities of the many. Isn't that right, Caio? That is right, Miguel. Well, us at the Memo organization, we are a space to foster dialogue, and we discuss male emotions and all the topics related. So we believe that there is a lot of value behind that. Some of our members, besides being part of other affinity groups and the initiatives that are developed by them, they also debate some topics that are related to different causes. Our major challenge has been to ensure more diversity and more conversation. And so, all the discussions have a personal starting point, and the cross-sectional discussions are not as approached. So we had a rapid growth in our members with different cultures, backgrounds, and ages, but we are still focused on that heterosexual white male group. We want to have more diversity. We want black men. We want groups that are less represented in our membership.
Exactly, Caio. I can say that in our conversations about intersectionality in Cá Entre Nós, this is starting to take shape in our last discussions. In our system, after 3 work meetings, we organized a round table about important topics related to gender equity, and it's very enriching when we analyze the different sufferings experienced by women depending on their social rank, skin color, or sexual orientation, which is exactly what intersectionality is about. First, we must become aware and work to communicate what we've learned to Klabin or to other interested parties. And just as important is the perception that difficulties tend to increase when we account for the particularities of each woman. When we start to address not only the number of women in leadership positions, but to correlate the number of women in leadership positions who are also LGBTI+, or the number of women in leadership positions who are LGBTI+ and black, and all of this representativeness. Great, Malu. I would just like to add that although we still have a lot of work to do in terms of instigating, we started to introduce a dialogue to bring it to the surface like 2 years ago, as we do with Memo, for example, and part of our management, to seek allies for this highly diverse group, LGBTI+. Our role is also to complement affirmative actions implemented by the diversity groups and encourage people to reflect about what's normal, what's natural, what's a woman, what's a man. We know we have many challenges ahead, but we are working hard to take this first step towards inclusion more than anything else, until we no longer need, as Ivone has mentioned, to separate different groups in different boxes. Exactly, Aline. We developed this work bearing in mind that it adds value and reflects the care Klabin devotes to sustainability, given the motto of these groups is to address the issue of human rights. I'd like to thank you all for this conversation. Lili, Miguel, Ivone, Caio, and Malu. Until next time. Thank you. Until next time.
Thank you, everyone.